The 29th of November, 1966. A freighter northbound on Lake Huron battles through stormy seas. A familiar occurrence befalls it, as it splits in half and sinks with tremendous loss of life. Just as it occurred not a decade before with the Carl D. Bradley. But while the story of the Daniel J. Morrell isn't unique, the tale of survival that goes along with it is. Because one can't discuss the loss of the Carl D. Bradley without also talking about the miraculous survival of one of its crew, Dennis Hale, who, in the face of insurmountable odds, made it home alive when every one of his shipmates didn't. The year is 1906, and the Great Lakes are as alive as ever with traffic and big industry. Ships getting steadily larger and larger to fuel America's burgeoning industrial needs. This year, in April, the massive 601-foot Pierpont Morgan would be launched and crowned the Queen of the Lakes, an unofficial title for the lengthiest vessel currently sailing the Great Lakes. She beat out the prior vessel by nearly 50 feet, but not long after this, in August, the SS Edward Y. Townsend was launched, an impressive 603 feet, claiming the title of Queen. A month later, her unofficial sister ship, the Daniel J. Morrell, would be launched from the West Bay shipbuilding yards in West Bay City, Michigan. Though a foot shorter and made in two separate yards, the Townsend and Morrell were both commissioned by the same Cambria Steamship Company, and were nearly identical in construction, thus leading to the ships being called sister ships. The twin behemoths steaming under the same banner and carrying the same cargo. Their fates seemed to be intertwined, as time would soon show. The Daniel J. Morrell, upon her construction, was 603 feet in length and 58 feet at the beam. The large freighter had a 32-foot depth and an impressive 7,239 gross registered ton displacement. She initially had two Scotch Marine boilers producing 1,878 horsepower, her propulsion being a triple expansion steam engine. In 1922, she would actually be outfitted with a gyro compass, becoming the first freighter on the lakes to be fitted with one. Morrell and her sister ship Townsend entered service with the Cambria Steamship Company and chartered them to work for the M.A. Hanna Company until 1930, when they changed management to the Bethlehem Transportation Company until their final days. All through this time, the pair putting forth some impressive hauling numbers and proving to be very profitable and reliable. In 1945, the Daniel J. would receive a major refit modernization. Its older Scotch Marine boilers were replaced by newer Babcock and Wilcox boilers, nearly doubling her horsepower to 3,200. Her engine was replaced in 1956 with a 3-cylinder Skinner Uniflow engine, increasing her overall speed a few knots, but engineers also noted a slight vibration at higher RPMs. In total, this added an additional 500 tons to the ship's displacement, and ended up increasing the overall length to 609 feet, with other additions. The 1966 season for the Daniel J. Morrell was going along smoothly. For Captain Arthur I. Crawley, age 47, this was his first year in command of the Morrell. Born in Cuyahoga, Ohio in 1919, Captain Crawley had spent 29 years on the Great Lakes freighters, gaining his master's certification just a few years prior. But this would be his first year as a captain. But the season had been prosperous. Morrell had just gotten out of a dry dock at the beginning of the season, receiving a dry dock inspection on the 25th of February during her dry docking in Toledo, Ohio. Shortly after this, she received her yearly inspection, again in Toledo, on the 15th of April, finally receiving a mid-season inspection in Buffalo, New York on the 20th of July. Not one of these yielded any significant concerns, not like the Carl D. Bradley less than a decade prior. On the 26th of November, Daniel J. Morrell and Edward Dwight Townsend pulled into Buffalo, New York to offload, finishing their 33rd trip that season. This would have been their final trip of the season, but Bethlehem wasn't pleased with the season's numbers, requesting one last run from the two ships up to Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, then back to Buffalo, to ensure a yearly bonus for the two crews. Captain Crawley would, of course, oblige, in spite of the worsening weather report. After ballasting down, the Morrell would depart the Buffalo breakwater at 2300 on the 26th of November. Unfortunately for 21-year-old deck watchman John Grow and 26-year-old watchman Dennis Hale, they had arrived at the dock in Buffalo a few minutes after 2300, in time to watch the stern of their ship sailing out into a stormy Lake Erie. The two men had driven home after mooring in Buffalo, thinking the season to be over, Grow to his home in Erie, Pennsylvania, and Hale to his home in Ashtabula, Ohio. They returned to the ship as fast as possible, but had just missed it. Utilizing the radios at Coast Guard Station Buffalo, they contacted the Morrell and agreed to meet up in Windsor, Ontario, when the Morrell would be refueling, taking on 200 tons of stoker coal. So the pair were off to make the long drive. About 4 hours after the Morrell departed, her sister ship, the Townsend, followed suit, leaving Buffalo at around 0300 on the 27th of November. Arriving in Windsor before the Morrell, unbeknownst to Grow and Hale, the Morrell had beat its way across Lake Erie through rough weather and had opted to anchor out in the mouth of the Detroit River prior to proceeding upbound the channel. Anchoring out at about 1800 before radioing in to Bethlehem Transportation to let them know. In the night, the Edward Townsend would pass the anchored Morrell, heading upbound the Detroit River. In the morning hours of 06:55, Morrell weighed anchor in time to make it up to Windsor to refuel. Pulling into the coal docks at 07:05, Grow and Hale, by this time, had been waiting around 15 hours to board their ship. There was no way that Dennis Hale could have known that the ship he was stepping onto, the one he had served on for 3 years, would be gone in less than 24 hours. The Morrell had finished loading on fuel and was underway by 07:30, upbound the Detroit River and passing by the city itself not long after. A ship observer passed on their position to Bethlehem Steel as they did so. Shortly after, at 0900, the Morrell contacted the company themselves for their daily position report. This would be their last. The Townsend had passed by Detroit the night before, anchoring just near Stag Island, in the St. Clair River just north of Lake St. Clair. Weather at the time had been steadily worsening, and the captain of the Townsend, Captain Thomas J. Connolly, didn't want to venture out into Lake Huron just yet. They anchored at around 0400 on the 28th. By 1300 that day, the Daniel J. Morrell passed her sister ship at anchor, Captain Crawley discussing over the radio with Captain Connolly the worsening weather report, considering the noon forecast and what it held for them. Both deciding their vessels could handle it so long as they maintained a northerly course upbound Lake Huron. The weather was due to be coming from the north, putting their bows into the sea. So long as they did this and perhaps hugged the western shore, staying close to Michigan, they believed the vessels would ride it out just fine. The wind at the time of this call was out of the west and light, anywhere between 5 and 15 knots. At 14:53, Townsend pulled the hook and proceeded north out of the mouth of the St. Clair River and onto Lake Huron, into the waiting jaws of a November storm. At the time, Captain Connolly wasn't sitting idly by. Instead, he was listening in to conversations on the radio, discussions of vessels on the topic of weather, most reporting relatively light winds, the highest being 24 knots. Connolly contacted Crawley to inform him he was falling in behind him, and they proceeded north, estimating the two ships to be about 20 nautical miles distant, as Crawley reported having just passed the Lake Huron lightship. There was a long period of silence as the two ships steamed their way into the darkening skies. Aboard the Morrell, Dennis Hale would be performing his last 4 to 8 deck watch aboard the ship, inspecting the holds. At and around 1600, he would enter the cargo hold and find about 18 inches of water on deck. Nothing too terribly concerning, as the side tanks were known to leak and had visible holes in the sides of them. Dennis reported these to the master, who acknowledged them and showed no major level of concern. At 2000, Dennis was off watch and remembered the ship was riding well. The winds were growing stronger quickly, though, as the barometer dropped rapidly. 30 knots and steadily climbing, with seas of about 8 feet, or 2.5 meters. But in spite of this, Dennis was able to walk along the spar decks, heading aft to the galley for dinner before heading back forward to his cabin to get some sleep before his next watch. His cabin was located below the forward pilot house next to the anchor windlass. He remembers hearing the anchor lightly banging against the hull, but admits to not being awoken by the motion of the vessel or the sounds of the weather. In the pilot house above him, though, tense communications between the Morrell and Townsend would be sent back and forth into the night. As the ship steadily steamed north out into Huron, the weather only worsened, and their forward progress only slowed. The winds blew harshly from the north, the entirety of the lake's fetch only assisting in growing the wave height significantly. By 2200, Connolly was talking to Crawley about his concerns of the deteriorating weather conditions. By this time, the winds had steadily grown to nearly 45 knots from the north, and the seas had built up to 12 feet, or 3.6 meters, with crest distances of anywhere between 250 and 300 feet apart. The storms also showed no signs of slowing, only gaining in potency as the ships twisted and slammed into oncoming swells. Their forward progress had dropped to a crawl, sometimes only managing a measly 4 knots ahead. They wouldn't be sailing through this anytime soon. At this time, Captain Connolly restricted all the spar decks, forbidding any crew from walking out onto the weather decks. 23:15, winds and seas were reaching a fevered pitch. Winds up to 55 knots and seas reaching a steady 20 foot or 6 meters with the occasional 25 footer or 7.6 meters. Green water crashing onto the pilot house. The weather was just getting worse as the empty freighters flexed and shuddered. On one or two occasions, Captain Connolly suggested to Captain Crawley that they turn back, heading either to Thunder Bay to anchor or back south to Port Huron. But Crawley didn't agree. Far too concerned that if they tried to come about, their lighter vessels would broach and get caught in the trough of the seas, unable to come about and at risk of capsizing. On top of that, turning about wouldn't remove them from their troubles. With stern seas, they ran the risk of their props coming out of the water with each passing wave, overtaxing their engines. On top of that, the quartering seas would cause more twisting and flexing to the ship. In his mind, staying the course was the best bet. As if to confirm his fears whilst on the radio at 23:50, he and Connolly were forced to disconnect as the Townsend was ripped off its course by a sudden, violent, harsh winds. Grabbing the bow of the ship like a sail and forcing it to veer hard to starboard, threatening to send the vessel broadside to the winds and seas. Only by increasing power and forcing the rudder hard to port was he able to stop the spin, the vessel coming about nearly 30 degrees off course before finally counteracting it. At midnight 15 on the 29th of November, Captain Connolly contacted Captain Crawley to inform him of what had happened. Crawley explaining that he had had a similar event just happen. The two kept the conversation brief, too preoccupied on staying on course to keep on the call. Crawley hung up, and it was the last transmission ever received by the Daniel J. Morrell. At or around 2 in the morning, Dennis Hale is awoken by a loud thump, to which he incorrectly attributed it to the anchor pounding against the hull. A second reverberated through his cabin, sending the book sitting on his wall-mounted bookcase tumbling to the deck. A startled and slightly irritated Hal went to turn on the lights in his rack and found it didn't work. What he didn't realize just yet was that the entire forward section of the ship was without power. Suddenly, the battery-powered general emergency alarm sounds throughout the ship. Hale springs out of his rack and grabs a life vest before running half-naked out of his cabin to the weather deck. The deck strewn with melting snow, Dennis realized two things. There was no power, and he couldn't see the stern of the Morrell. Then a moment later, he could. It rose up as if right from the sea, still fully illuminated with power. Dennis watched as the center of the ship hogged and sagged, a growing tear down the middle sparking as the two sections rubbed against one another. Grasping the dire nature of what was happening, Dennis ran back into his cabin to try and grab some kind of clothing to cover himself from the elements. In the darkness, he could only find a Navy-style pea coat. It would have to do. He ran back out on deck, clad in only the jacket, a life vest, and boxer shorts. Assembled by the pontoon-style life raft were all the crew of the forward section of the ship, including the captain and the two mates. They sat by the raft, some tying themselves down to the pontoon-style float, all in various levels of dress and varying degrees of shock. Dennis looked to the back deck as the ship tore down the middle, like a sheet of paper, as he described it. He saw no one on the after section. The aft raft was untouched, and neither of the lifeboats had been lowered. The captain mentioned that the radios hadn't worked, meaning no distress calls had been made, but that there was another vessel just off the port bow, and the Townsend not far behind them. As the ship tore apart, the crew sitting on the raft watched 38-year-old oiler Donald Wooster step out onto the aft deck. He stood there holding an oil can, staring straight ahead at the disaster developing before his eyes, giving no indication that he comprehended it at all, watching silent and stone-faced as the Morrell tore herself apart before his very eyes. What was there to say? What was there to do? It's hard to imagine what could have possibly been going through the man's head as the ship split up and sank from beneath his feet. Finally, after much flexing and tearing, the sections were torn apart. The stern section, still under power, began to push the foundering forward section out of the way, ramming into it repeatedly and jostling the men in the raft. The bow was sinking as it was forced sideways by the wind, and its severed aft section running into it. Finally, Hale sat on the raft, staring in fear as the aft section came charging forward. Lights still illuminated its massive, now wide-open cargo hold. Severed steam lines billowed steam into the yawning cavern of the hold as the ship steamed forward. It looked like the open mouth of a great beast trying to swallow the crew whole. Dennis was certain that the aft section would run them over and kill them all. But as it rammed them, they were struck by a wave, and the group of about 15 men were swept overboard into the frigid lake water. Dennis was sent tumbling into the dark water, coughing and sputtering as he came up just 10 feet from the dislodged raft, now bobbing in the water near him. He saw no one on the surface with him, but just focused on swimming to the raft. By the time he got there were two others that also climbed aboard. 41-year-old deckhand Arthur Stojek and 20-year-old deckhand John J. Cleary. They helped the shocked and already numb Dennis Hale climb aboard. Stojek was wearing only his thin pajamas and a life jacket, whilst Cleary wore only jeans and a sweater with a life jacket. All three of them were very ill-suited for an extended period of time on the raft. As Dennis crawled over to the deck box installed on the life raft to check their supplies, the others called out at seeing someone else in the water. They helped in pulling aboard 42-year-old wheelman Charles Fuzzy Fossbender. The man had been in the pilot house at the time of the sinking and was fully dressed, making him a bit more prepared for this than the others. The first order of business on the raft was getting signaling devices and getting rescued. If the captain was right, there was a ship not too far away. The four men beat and bashed the box, which was dented upon being swept overboard. Once they had it open, they scrambled for the contents. Hale took out the flare gun and a pair of parachute flares. In all the excitement, a pair of the precious flares were washed overboard. He fired off two of the flares before the handle and barrel of the flare gun broke into two pieces, forcing him to have to hold them together to fire them. Their small raft was being buffeted about in the heavy seas and winds. Hale looked to set up the sea anchor and storm oil for some stability. Storm oil being a canister set inside a sea anchor that slowly lets out oil to cover the surface of the water around a life raft, possibly calming the seas a bit and keeping down the spray whipped up by the wind. But to his chagrin, Art Stojek had tossed the can of oil overboard, thinking it worthless. Already he was speaking nonsense, succumbing to shock and already hypothermic. Then one of the men began to scream and wave his arms. The Morrell's foresection had finally sank. From the time of Hale waking up to around the time he entered the water, it had been around 8 minutes. The foresection hadn't floated much longer. Fully submerged, Fuzzy said he saw a rescue ship a little more than a mile away. Hale looked and sadly told the man that it was just the stern section of the Morrell. Still under power, still steaming off into the storm, stuck in the trough as it plows on without direction or purpose. A chicken with its head cut off. At least 14 men still possibly on board, with not a clue of how to get off it. The stern section would continue on this way for 5 nautical miles and nearly 45 minutes before sinking. No one aboard the stern section would survive, and we'll never know just what they had done in those final moments. Hale popped another flare for the men to huddle around for warmth as they sat around, discussing their chances as it began to snow. They decided they were better off in the raft than anyone else. They settled in for a long, cold night. No distress call had been made, and no one was presently looking for them. So how long could they survive out there in the cold, drenched and half naked? By morning time, after a tormenting night in the sea spray and snow, dawn slowly broke at about 7:30, and the weather was calming, the snow ebbing. Laying on his side facing John Cleary, Hale could see his face was pale and some foam was coming from his mouth. Dennis jabbed him to wake him up, asking, "John, are you all right?" He didn't respond. John Cleary, at age 20, was the second youngest aboard the Morrell. He had passed away in the night, likely from hypothermia. He had survived less than 5 hours. Hale rolled over. Behind him was Art Stojek, who also didn't respond. He too had passed away in the night. Terrified that he was now alone, he called out to Fuzzy, who was positioned near Dennis's legs. He thankfully responded, saying he was okay and had been praying through the night. The pair talked a little through the day, discussing their chances and what they'd do when they were rescued and made it home. By 9 o'clock, Daniel J. Morrell had officially gone 24 hours since the Bethlehem Steel Company had contacted them. They were overdue for their radio position call, but they had just been through a bad storm. Vessels were being reported as having topside damage from wind and ice. So when the Morrell didn't report in, no major alarms were raised. They likely just didn't have functioning radios, so the company waited. Aboard the raft, Fuzzy told Dennis that he could see land. Dennis asked if they were close. Fuzzy stated plainly that they weren't. The Michigan shore was in sight, but may as well have been the moon for the two freezing, tired men. Fuzzy had slowly developed a nasty cough that had only gotten worse through the day. What Hale wasn't aware of was that the man had been crushed by something when being swept overboard. His lungs were filling with blood. As they drifted closer to shore, Hale could make out houses. They'd be grounded soon, He told Fuzzy, "Maybe someone will see us," to which Fuzzy responded, "Well, they better hurry because it feels like my lungs are filling up." To which Hale suggested trying to cough whatever it was up. Charles Fossbender attempted just that, coughing and hacking to no effect. Shortly after, he slumped to the deck of the raft, lifeless. He passed away around 1400 on the 29th, leaving Dennis alone on the raft, the lone survivor of the Daniel J. Morrell. He quietly settled in as the sun started to set. He'd be on the life raft for yet another night, alone on a lake with no one around even looking for him. By nightfall, the raft had grounded and was bumping up against the rocks, but was still about 100 yards from shore. There was no way that Dennis could wade to shore in his exhausted state, so he lay there, at one point the raft rotating so he could see the lights from a nearby farmhouse. He screamed in vain, hoping someone would hear him, to no avail. Later in the night, the lights went out, and Dennis settled into fits of restless sleep. He had now been on the raft for more than 24 hours. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the Morrell had missed yet another radio call-in, making it 2 days since they had been in contact with Bethlehem Steel directly. Concerns were raised, but yet again the alarm wasn't sounded. The Townsend should have been right on its tail, and they hadn't yet made it to the St. Mary's River. But soon, a bit before noon, the Edward White Townsend pulled into the Lime Island fueling dock in the St. Mary's River. Captain Connolly was informed of 45 inches of water in the holds, as well as a massive crack on the starboard side of the ship on the weather decks. He realized that the Morrell hadn't pulled into the St. Mary's River and immediately called Bethlehem. Finally, at 12:15, Bethlehem contacted the Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center in Cleveland, reporting the Daniel J. Morrell missing, a search being launched immediately, 30 hours after the Morrell had sank. Multiple cutters and vessels set out to search, including the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Mackinac, Coast Guard cutter Bramble, and the Coast Guard cutter Acacia. Small boats from stations Harbor Beach, Port Huron, and Saginaw River all set out to search, and both fixed-wing and rotary aircraft from Air Station Detroit and Traverse City set out to search. Before the search had even officially begun, the Coast Guard small boat 30386 from Station Harbor Beach had found a body at around 12:10. The body was floating wearing a life vest with Daniel J. Morrell stenciled across the back. The debris and bodies would slowly start to be found by the search assets over the next few hours. On the raft, Dennis barely clung to life, dying of thirst, hypothermia, and exhaustion. Over the past 36 hours, he had lost 25 pounds. Blood was pooling in his legs, and he had frostbite in several places. He was hallucinating and drifting in and out of consciousness. Some would later paint his ordeal as a beautiful human will to survive, a defiance against death and a dedication to perseverance. But Dennis would later in life fully denounce that. The man was hopeless, often begging for death. On one occasion, he remembers sticking his fingers down his throat, trying to choke himself to death in a desperate bid for release, to which he only managed to make himself gag. He admitted that he didn't want to live. He didn't want to die, he just wanted it to be over. By 1600, Dennis was stirred to consciousness, hearing what he thought were seagulls overhead. The birds had been a constant irritant. But looking up, he realized it was in fact a Coast Guard helicopter that had spotted his raft with the bodies of his shipmates and himself aboard. As the helo landed, the Coast Guardsman was shocked to find Dennis alive after 36 hours of being on the raft. Dennis could only say, "I love you," over and over as they brought him on board and flew him to the closest hospital. His odds of survival still extremely low. So low was it, in fact, that upon entering him into the hospital, he was given a priest to talk to and to issue him his last rites. Dennis spoke to the man, even telling him of his hallucinations. He remembers being lifted from his body, taken up high above the lake, and ending up back upon the deck of the Daniel J. Morrell, alongside all of his shipmates, who greeted each other again with elation, until finally one looked at Dennis, asking him why he was there, and that he wasn't supposed to be there yet. He spoke of seeing a white-robed man standing on his raft, with kind eyes and a beard. The man warned Dennis not to eat the ice from his coat, like a father scolding a child, telling him the ice would lower his body temp and he would die. To all of this, the priest cautioned him to perhaps not speak of these things, something that deeply cut Dennis, perhaps attributing to his silence after the incident, speaking only to the Coast Guard about the incident, not breaking his silence for 25 years. As bodies were pulled from the lake, several were left with the burning question, how did this happen? How had a steel freighter sunk on the lakes in a storm yet again, for the second time in less than a decade. Something had to be found out. This couldn't happen again. 60 dead between the Morrell and the Bradley, and only 3 survivors between them. A tribunal launched from the recently formed NTSB, or National Transportation Safety Board, picked over everything. Testimony from Hale, past captains, past crews, old inspections, old damage, not a stone left unturned. Then finally the smoking gun, the deck of the Townsend, cracked and damaged. The sister ship of the Morrell and its closest living relative, for 2 years after she would sit in the St. Mary's River, living evidence of what had occurred. It was revealed through her the fatal flaw of long-deck freighters in the cold water. The steel used in them prior to 1948 were of poorer quality, having a high sulfur content. When in cold conditions, the steel became brittle and inflexible. This, combined with the twisting force of the storm, had snapped the Morrell in half, like it had done with the Carl D. Bradley before this, and nearly done to the Townsend. The Townsend would never sail under her own power again. A few years later, her hulk was purchased by a scrap company in Europe. She was towed out the St. Lawrence Seaway, but along the way, she was subjected to a North Atlantic storm. In a fashion shockingly similar to her sister, the Edward White Townsend would snap in half whilst under tow, forcing the crew to cut her loose and let her sink. The empty freighter slipping down below the waves in the vicinity relatively near to the last resting place of the RMS Titanic. Dennis Hale suffered in silence for many years after the incident, racked with survivor's guilt to which he'd never truly recover from. He required numerous surgeries after this on his legs, but many believed his lack of clothing and large stature had attributed it to his survival. The wet clothing would have likely only kept him cold. He still needed most of his toes amputated, though. Dennis finally broke his silence 25 years after the incident, going on to have talks and even writing a book on the tragedy, sole survivor Dennis Hale's own story. In 2009, he went out on a dive boat to the side of the sunken Morrell. Standing on board as divers went below to video the wreck. At one point, a plastic rope was handed to him. It was connected to the bow of the Morrell. After 43 years, he was finally connected to the ship and the 28 shipmates he had left behind. The crew of the dive boat stepped back, leaving the emotional man to his thoughts. Dennis Hale passed away on the 2nd of September, 2015, at the age of 75. Thanks for listening into another episode of Maritime Horrors. I know this one's coming a lot later. It's been a while since I've uploaded, and I appreciate everyone for hanging around and being patient with me. I'd like to thank all my patrons and all that, who have been, I'm sure, chomping at the bit, waiting for some sort of content to come out. So I'm sorry this took so long, but I wanted to do justice for this topic, and I wanted it to be good. I kind of got inside my own head, kind of worrying about making this the best that I could, but I promise you there's a lot more content lined up, some very interesting collaborations that I'm very excited for, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I promise it will not take this long to come out with another episode. I'd like to thank Windagoon, who gave me an awesome shout-out. I've been talking to him a bit. He's a really cool dude. He does some great content. If you're not hear from him, I definitely suggest checking out his channel. With him giving me that shout out, I'd like to return the love. There is a smaller channel that did a video on the Daniel J. Morrell that was fantastic. That channel name is Ship Geek, exploring maritime disasters and triumphs. I'll link that. Definitely check him out. He's a smaller channel, but he makes very good content. Give him some love and try to get him up to some good numbers too. We are very, very close to 100K, and that's incredible. I never expected to get this far, so hopefully this video bumps us up above that, because that would be fantastic. Right now, we have some new shirts up on the TeePublic that the channel artist made, and they are absolutely awesome. If you want to support her, every t-shirt, anything you buy from that goes directly to her and helps pay her for the fantastic job that she does for the channel. We're also working maybe on some interesting other things to buy. If you're a fan of patches, I got some good news to you. We got some cool patches that are coming out, and those will be available very, very soon, so watch out for those. Other than that, that's all I have for you, so fair winds and following seas, shipmates.